judgment against some sort of criteria, and risk management, which is about the making decisions. Yeah? They're actually doing something. Yeah? I mean, as a consultant, I don't mind if people want to pay me to do these two things and never do anything, just put my report on the shelf. Okay? And then come back in 5 years, ask me to do it again. You know, it's great business. But the point of all of these things, and the point of most engineering, everything you ever learn, it's a tool to use to help you make a decision. Okay? So the point of all of this is to get towards risk management. Yeah? We talked about failure frequency assessment, historic data prediction. I don't think we did the exact, showed you an example, did I? We might do that now, actually. And we looked at some consequence assessment and looked at some simplified models, the models that you can do by hand. In reality, you hardly ever do them by hand anymore. You would buy somebody's software, which at these days means you're probably having to pay D&V an obscene amount of money. So I think we got a quote for Safety, which is FAST is the consequence modelling. Safety's got a little frequency add-on, so you can actually do risk curves directly from it. The 6-month license was £18,000. Yeah. So most engineering companies work on about 10% profit margin. So that would mean you would need to be doing £180,000 worth of work in those 6 months to justify the software in the first place. So, but since Shell stopped selling Fred, except for Shell projects, D&B can charge what they like. Yeah. So they're just whatever. You know, and have you been to Norway? Beer is terribly expensive. They probably think it's cheap, 18,000. You know, that's like a rounding apart. Okay. And the bit that I always hope that isn't a surprise, that risk we're talking about is some combination of probability and consequences. Yeah? And we can talk about all kinds of risk, but the risk we're talking about mainly here is safety consequences. So this is really death. Yeah? But we could look at money. We look at environmental consequences, yeah? Okay, I won't go through those, yeah? Failure frequency, we've got historic data we can get from all sorts of databases. It's nice and simple, problems being not all the data is recorded, and if you want a specific value for a specific pipeline, good luck. Especially if you're looking at a new project. So if you're now in the design team of a new project and they want a risk assessment, when you go to the historic data, there will not be a pipeline that matches your pipeline. And the answer then isn't that the failure frequency of your pipeline is going to be 0. If you're lucky, it'll be 0 on day 1. But, you know. Okay. But if we're not going to use historic data, we're going to predict. Luckily, UCOPA will publish these summaries of the defect values that you can use. Incident rate, data from the UK. If you're somewhere that looks like the UK, the way it manages developments, i.e. the fact that there's not very much land and lots of people, so there's quite strict rules, you need permissions, then it works. If it's somewhere else, somewhere there's a bit more like a banana republic, like America, where if you own the land, you can do whatever you like, it's yours all the way to the other side of the world, then you might want to think about actually probably getting more damage. Failure, we talked about last time whether you've actually done these or not. At some point you will be, can't believe the pipeline engineering course doesn't cover these equations at some point. Yeah? So NG18 is for metal loss, so either corrosion or a pure gouge, and then the Hopkins-Cairns or the EPRG or the API 579 dent gouge model, depending on which reference you pick up, but they're all the same model. Random variables, just use the defect dimensions, don't bother with the other stuff. You can do a full SRA if you want, it just takes longer. Need a bigger computer, and then you can solve it. When I first started giving these lectures about 10 years ago, we used to recommend Monte Carlo simulation because this was hard. This is now a lot easier. Computers are better, but also that means this is quite fast as well. But if you do numerical integration, you get the same answer each time. If you do Monte Carlo simulation, you will trend to a stable answer. But if you might need to do 10 million simulations to get there. Yeah? And you can do it if you've got any VB skills or Python. Anyone know what Python is? 4th generation language. Makes it nice and easy to do things, a bit more object oriented. We've got some bright guys in the office who knock something up in Python in about 30 minutes to do this. Or you can get these add-ons for Excel. At Risk is the one we use. a crystal ball and a solver. Or you can go to the really specialist stuff, Strurel from Germany, Proban, which is like an add-on to so you can do probabilistic and finite element analysis. You know, as if finite element analysis wasn't making it up in the first place. So the more weird you get with these programs, the more all you're really doing is pushing pretty pictures for reports because nobody really believes it. Okay, so a little example. See if this, if I can get this to work. Okay, so we have here a little calculation, yeah? So we have a pipeline, yeah? 36 inch, 12.7, 75 bar, 5% excess bar. This is, from that upwards, is the most common pipeline in the UK for the transmission system. The gas transmission system is pretty much what most of it was built into that standard. Sharpie energy, that's pretty low these days. You can get 300 joules now, but when these were built, that was the minimum in the API 5L spec. And when you're doing a risk assessment, most of the time you know very little about the actual pipeline. Yeah? You haven't got the original material data, so we have a tendency to use the minimum value that was applicable at the time. Yeah? The equations actually don't vary that much for Sharpie, it's not that sensitive. Area classification, so we're going to put something in. We've got depth of cover, standard UK depth of cover 1.1, no protection, and what we're going to get out is some things. So we've got some modification factors, so local modifier, this is just so we can fudge it. So if we're doing it somewhere that's not the UK. Depth, 1.1 metres, so that's normalised to 1. Protection, there's no protection, so again it's normalised. When we put the area in, we get a value. And we already know, that's quite interesting, that's been the last one. I'll change in a second when I put the values. That's based, so this is based on the geometry of the pipe. This is what you would get. What you need to know is how it hit. If you remember we talked about there were 2 parts to it. There's the probability that pipeline's hit in the first place and the probability that it will fail, given the range of damage that's likely. So, but if we put in, I don't know, we stick an answer in there. So we go for rural area, which is UK gas code. We get out some numbers. So, so it fails. We're taking a rupture 14 times per million kilometre years. So not that big. If you've got, even if you've got a 1,000-kilometre pipeline, you can work that out and invert it and get the average time between failures would be, or you wouldn't expect a failure for another however many thousand years. I mean, it's not totally true because it can happen any time in that period, so it is an average. But as I said, I got a young guy called Aaron to write this for me in about, came back in about half an hour. So there's like half a page of Visual Basic in the background that does the numerical integration. And you can pick up papers that explain how to do it, IPC papers. If you put in S, immediately it jumps because in suburban areas, which would be equivalent to about class 3 in American terms, rural is probably more like a class 2. We don't really have any class 1 pipelines in the UK. The difference between rural and suburban is about a factor of 3.6 on hit rate. You get almost 4 times more hits in a suburban area. Yeah, because there's more activity, more digging, yeah? Okay. Let's get back to this. These embedded little call-outs never work very well. Okay, so yeah, so we've got that. Those are the basic details. Maybe it was a bit more sophisticated than I thought. And you get these results. So these, for the UK, we would use these in Curays for the UK. If this was America, I might say, if this was a class 3, I might think, maybe we'll get twice as much damage because there's less planning permission. And once you own the land, you've kind of got a lot more freedom to do things. Yeah? Although they tend to now have a lot more one-call systems. So in theory, if you ring, you should get a response that says, no, don't dig there. There is a pipeline where it's filled. There are some one-call systems in the UK, but they don't cover everybody. Which then starts you to worry about whether it's better to have one or not, because does it give the construction contractor a false sense of security? If he rings the one-call system that exists in the UK and they say that it's fine, but it only covers 80% of the operators, well, what if you're in a field that's... So, but if you're, hopefully the reason for coming on this course is you get to be the person who supervises the excavations, not the person who's doing the excavation. So just, anytime anyone digs a hole, stand back, just in case. It's always my advice. Okay, so consequence assessment. So some simple models, quick rules of thumb, good for semi-quantitative risk assessment. We talked a little about the potential impact radius in the B31.8S equation, which is used in American legislation to define a high consequence area, which I call the big circle of death. It's a nice, simple way. But for a full QRA, must update the clip R. Nobody has a computer that looks like that anymore. You've got complex models, you need to run them lots of times, you get a range of results if you use the literature. So basically you buy some software and you ask them, have they validated it experimentally? So in the software we use, Fred, it has a tendency to say, we've done the tests in this range and we're confident that it's good for this bit, but outside it, over here, you're on your own. You can use the number if you want, but we're not guaranteeing it. And we'll come back to that when we look at risk acceptance. Yeah? So a lot of these, the software, even the best, the very expensive software, hasn't been validated for everything you're doing for it. So there is an uncertainty in the answers. This is a simple one. So effective release rate, two-ended release, some sort of decay factor. Remember, this is what we're trying to do is give us an effective release rate for the whole incident rather than the transient blowdown. But things that you can look these up in data books for different fluids, different gases. So not that hard to do by hand. Building burning distance from the B31.8S. So for that pipeline, when we're talking about 36-inch, 75 bar, we're talking 250 meters from the pipeline. If there was a rupture, ignited rupture, we would expect buildings to burn just from the radiation 250 meters away. Again, this is a very simple equation, so I probably should have rounded this to 250, not 248 is probably too exact. Occasionally I see this written as, people who answer at this point, it's about 10 decimal places, it's not really going to be that good. But that would be 250 meters just from the radiation. Obviously, if you've got wind blowing, you get fire spread from building to building, like with San Bruno in San Francisco. Okay, so we look at this. Another simple one for radiation. So if we take that effective release rate, we would get this radiation with distance. And if you remember, 1 kilowatt per meter squared is kind of strong sunlight. So 1 kilowatt per meter squared is the kind of day in Newcastle that has people fainting on the streets from the heat, sort of thing. People have to take their coat off. So if you're starting at 1600, that's pretty hot. So so if you were at that 25 meters, well, you're probably not even going to feel it. Okay, so that was last 2 weeks ago's lecture. On to today. Risk calculation. We're going to talk about something called interaction length, and then individual and societal risk, and we're going to talk about risk acceptability. Concepts, how we make decisions. Surprisingly, some people are good at making decisions, some people are bad at making decisions. Organisations, on the whole, are shit at making decisions. They really, and your company systems, what a law is reasonably practicable. Talk about that, and a little bit about regulatory style, which usually just gives me an excuse to have another dig at Americans. Okay, remember this? Yeah. Done this bit, identify the hazards, hazard identification, we know what they are for pipelines. Since the Canadians came up with SCC in the 60s, nobody's invented any new way to kill a pipeline. Yeah, so you've got all the usual stuff. Frequency consequences, and now we're on to the mathsy bit. So, if you want to calculate risk due to a pipeline, yeah, the risk from the pipeline to the people that are nearby, you need to know, well, is it a leak or a rupture? Yeah. Because I'm only really interested in the dead people, then I really concentrate mainly on this for gas lines. A leak in a gas line, if it's a natural gas, not that big a deal. It is at low pressure, but not so bad at transmission pressures. If it's H2S, if you're in Kazakhstan, then these are bad because you might not know it's leaking and you've got the ability to kill people with a small leak. Whereas even the most unsophisticated pipeline company can usually spot when their pipeline's had a rupture, because something, they suddenly get no flow at the far end. Things start looking backwards in the control room. Everything starts running towards a point in the middle. We also need to know how often it's going to fail. What's the frequency of failure? We need to then know about the consequences. Are we going to model them varying with time, or are we just going to make a steady state assumption? And for a leak, steady state assumption is probably reasonable. Maybe not for a rupture, but if you were doing a simplistic or a first pass count, you might take that as an effective release rate. Location of the failure. Yeah. Does it matter if the pipeline fails in the middle of the desert? Matters in terms of cash flow, in terms of money, but you might have to compensate for the odd camel, but you're unlikely to kill lots of people. Yeah. So if you had to choose, if you've got a big network that some of it runs in the centre of cities and some of it runs in remote areas, well, having your failures in the remote areas looks like a good deal. Yeah. How many people are there? This is the same point, yeah? So, how many people are going to be around the place that you're interested in? How much time do they spend indoors and outdoors? So when we're doing assessments in the UK, we assume that in the daytime, 90% of the time is indoors, yeah? It's because the weather's miserable. In other parts of the world, it's the other way around. People spend all their time living outside because it's lovely, sort of thing. So when I do an assessment, I'm thinking, is this somewhere I'd go on holiday? Yes. Oh, maybe we'd be spending more time outdoors. And then, how much shelter is there? So, if you're the only house near the pipeline, and your pipeline is within that big circle where the building's going to burn down, when your house burns down, where are you going to go next? Yeah? Whereas if it's in an urban area, you can usually find the next, you jump over the garden fence, go into the next house, wait another 2 minutes until it starts to burn, and then into the next. Oh, sorry, I thought it was me. Into the next building. So in urban areas, you find that people escape even from inside the building burning distance. In rural areas, people are casualties outside the building burning distance. And there's this concept called interaction length, which I think the next slide's going to explain in more detail. So it's critical, yeah? What we really mean is the full length of the pipeline, yeah, over which a hazard could affect any specific location, yeah? So if you were, brought some pens this time. So if your pipeline is running here, yeah, and you live here, this is why I became an engineer, not an artist, then you're interested in, if it fails here, yeah, if we've got a big fire here, does it affect you? No, so really we were looking at the bit that where if there is a failure in that length, you will be affected. And so obviously that depends on things like how big the pipeline is and the pressure, how big this fire is going to be, and where you are. So yeah, much easier. So very simple, yeah. If we've got this concept called a hazard distance, and this might be the escape distance if you were outside, or the building burning distance. Yeah, there are some gaps in the notes, sorry. That's the university tries to teach us to be better lecturers. This is how we're meant to make sure you all listen, yeah? Rather than come and get the notes and then leave. I said, I've got a paper saying whether there's anyone here or not, so it doesn't bother me. But the university feels we ought to have better engagement with the students, which I think means is pseudo for making my life more difficult for you. But if we've got this hazard distance, which we're leaving slightly undefined, and you're stood on the pipeline, then obviously anywhere between those two fires, if the pipeline fails while you're there, you're going to be in hazard. And then a little bit of trigonometry. If you move further away, then you get like this. Yeah? So obviously, effectively, when you are away from the pipeline, yeah, in theory that's safe, but obviously if you really got to stand there while your eyebrows singe, so it's kind of. Remember, these are all simplistic models. Yeah, the real event is very dynamic and has some variance. Okay, so individual risk, yeah, is the risk from an individual's point of view. Yeah, kind of obvious. Yeah. So this is, if you're here, it's the, you want to know the risk to you. And we express it a lot as the chance of being killed per year during activity or whatever. So the chance of being killed by lightning in the UK is about 1 in 10 million. So chance of being killed in your lifetime, if we averaged it all out, it's about 1 in 100 every year. Say you live to be 100, a bit generous maybe. So anybody smoke? Yeah, well, we'd call you 50 then. So it'd be 2 in 100 chance of dying, But yeah, if you averaged out, in reality, you've got people tend to die when they're older, either as children, in the middle, in your years, you're meant to be the same. There's a little peak for boys about 17 when they become idiots and tend to drive badly and things like this. But in general, there's a nice smooth bathtub curve for people. If you average that out and said you live to 100 years, then obviously you have a 1 in 100 chance of dying from all causes every year. So, 2 times 10 to the minus 7, so that's 1.2 times 1.4, yeah. And one of the reasons for using this is you can compare it with historic data, which you tend to find is averaged over the whole population or a subset. When you look at, and lots of governments produce statistics on these sort of things, and one of the things to watch out for is if they do give you statistics on things like dangerous sports like rock climbing, have they averaged the number of people who died rock climbing last year over everybody in the country, or just the people who went rock climbing? Because it's a very different answer. So the risk of me dying from rock climbing, I am pretty certain is 0. I've got a terrible head for heights. But if you were a rock climber, there is a much bigger risk than if you average out that. So it's just be, again, when you're looking, much like when you're looking at the database data for pipeline failure, just be aware of what it is. And the government tends to present this individual risk in these terms. I don't know why, kind of non-SI units. Annual risk is the probability of death in 10 to the 5 years or per 10 to the 5 workers. Yeah? I have a funny feeling that when they first started doing this, then dividing by 10 to the 5 just meant they got a number between 1 and 10, so they're kind of using it as an index. Yeah? So this is quite often known as the fatal injury rate, and you also get statistics called the fatal accident rate, which is the probability of death in 10 to the 8 hours exposure. I can't even remember, I don't know whether this is a working life, so I can't remember where 10 to the 8 came from, but it's just, it doesn't matter anymore, that's just how the statistics get presented. And this is, oh, hello. There's a typo there, isn't there?
Sorry, may I ask a question regarding the statistics? It's all the topic. Regarding government statistics, do they sell these statistics?
Well, in the UK, they give them away for free. You can get it off the HC database.
Because for doing this statistic, you need people.
Yeah, no. Well, the government in the UK, the Government Statistics Office provides this data. For workplace deaths, it's very good because there's various bits of legislation that say if you kill someone at work, you have to report it. So they have very good statistics on that. But this is the. I don't know if you can read that right now. In tiny letters. hc.gov.uk/statistics/fatals. And they've got every year they produce a report of fatal accidents in the workplace. Yeah. So the only one this year was they gave a number of fatalities in mining and quarrying, which includes offshore oil and gas extraction as well. These categories are all driven by EU categories. If you get the real report, there's a code letter that applies to each one, so you can then look up the Euro statistics as well and match them. And for some reason, they knew how many people had died, but they obviously didn't know how many people worked in the industry, so they couldn't get the rate. Yeah? So I mean, what we'd expect, you know. I don't know, this is the UK, yeah. So 136 people killed. So the worst industry is the service industry, yeah? But the rate is the smallest because pretty much everybody in the UK work. This is what we do now. We don't tend to do these other things very much. Yeah, we stopped making things. We outsourced all that. So now everybody works in an office, and death by paper cuts is pretty hard to come by. So, but still, 136 people in the office. You know, who knows what happened? You know, fell down the stairs. Don't know. Just had a heart attack at work. Might be counted as well. So the worst one, rate of fatal injury, farming, agriculture. Anybody know why? You know how most farmers die? It's the most common cause for farming deaths. Yeah, there's a lot of suicide as well. So accidents where you're on your own, yeah. So something's stuck in the machinery and you just think, oh, I'll just grab it, and then it takes your arm off and you're 2 miles from the nearest phone, never mind anything else, and sort of bleed to death. Or in the UK especially, it's very tough being a farmer now, especially in the north. In Europe, as a sheep farmer, they make a lot of money, so there's been a big rash of suicide.
So because of the working by home, I mean, they cannot hire the people. They were saying that the other day I heard about this agricultural problem with suicide. Why it's high suicide?
Because they've got debts, they can't make enough money. So yeah, and they, well, and a lonely life, maybe,
Yeah,
so yeah, it depends where you're farming, I would think. I think there's also a big issue in, I've seen a documentary as well about a lot of suicides in India as well, farmers, because they run up debts to buy seeds, and then they have a bad harvest, they can't pay it off. So, mind you, this is a surprising number because it's we don't really make anything anymore here very often much. So the fact we did enough manufacturing to kill 27 people came as a bit of a surprise. You'd expect this to be reasonable. If you've ever seen any building work, even the stuff you see around campus, which is kind of well regulated, you can tell why people are going to die doing these jobs. Yeah, Okay. But you can get all the statistics for the UK and for Europe. Beyond that, it's a bit harder to combine various places, and those ones are free. After that, as you say, you may have to purchase the report rather than. Okay. We go back to individual risk. Yeah. Individual risk is a measure of the frequency at which an individual, at a specific distance, so exactly where you are, may be expected to sustain a specified level of harm. And okay, let's just think about death. From the realisation of a specific hazard, which will be, say, the pipeline rupturing. So it's the view from the individual. How much of the pipeline can harm me? Yeah? So it's like the other, looking at the interaction length side of things. Yeah? How much of the pipeline is going to cause me harm? And if you live near a pipeline, you're interested in the individual risk. Yeah? Bizarrely, British Gas used to have a research centre here in Newcastle, in the northern Newcastle, in Killingworth, looking at offshore and transmission pipelines. No transmission pipelines anywhere near Newcastle. The research centre was here just because there was the right skills, because there were shipyards that had, and boiler makers, so you had people with materials and fracture mechanics skills. So I don't know if you see this sort of stuff a lot, presenting it. It's like a little contour map around a process plant. So for general population, you get the annual risk and the fatal accident rate. For process plant and offshore, you get these. Sometimes you get a value. Yeah? The risk in the control room is this. The risk on the drilling deck is this. Individual risk. And for onshore, you tend to get risk contours. So. It's another reason why you buy software, because doing these by hand is a right pain in the arse. Sort of thing, having to interpolate around a grid. It can be done. Sometimes also come across something called potential loss of life. Anyone come across that, PLL? You get this a lot offshore. So what they've done is they've grossed up the individual risk times the number of people in the different areas, and then they say the potential loss of life on the platform a year is this. And this excludes the exposure, how often you're working. So if you spend 12 hours on the drilling deck and then 12 hours in the accommodation block, you will have two different risk levels and they have to be together. But for pipelines, we use something called a risk transect, and we tend to assume that there is somebody always there. Yeah. Now there isn't normally somebody always there, but we can't prove there won't be because the pipeline's running public land. Yeah? So if we agree with the regulator, we just assess it on the basis that there was somebody always there, so we can compare one pipeline with another. Yeah, it's really important. It's a big difference. Yeah. So when you see individual risk givens for process plants and offshore, it tends to include the exposure, how often each person spends in different places. For pipelines, we just assume somebody's sat there the whole time. Okay. So transect is just a line perpendicular to something else. So we mean transect perpendicular pipeline. If we know that we can cause casualties at 500 meters, then we've got to have a transect that's at least 500 meters from the pipeline. Yeah? Get to that bit where you're at the edge of the circle. Calculate it along points on the transect for a theoretical 100% resident. It doesn't matter how many people are actually at each point, or if there's no one there at all. Yeah. And you get something that looks a bit like this. So quite often, you only need to show one side of it because it's symmetrical. And the reason it's not always symmetrical is because we're in a shelter. But quite often, a lot of people, for reasons that we'll apparent later, we don't really use individual risk as the decision maker. So it doesn't matter if you do a more generic assessment. But you get this. This is typical. You've got a slightly flattish bit to start with because you're going to be so dead. There's kind of once you get to dead, there's nothing beyond dead. So we don't. So you get a flat bit where everyone is dead. Just a bit of geometry making it go like that. And then you usually get a shoulder here that's to do with the difference between indoors and outdoors. So up here, this bit will be, doesn't matter whether you're indoors or outdoors, you like to become a fatality. When you get to here, it's probably only the people who are outdoors become fatalities. If you're indoor, you're safe. Yeah. So from that, you could say, is that if we went there, that would give us what, 150 metres? Maybe the building burning distance is around 150. Yeah, sometimes only one half shown if it's symmetrical. And if you were doing a simplistic assessment where you were probably ignoring shelter, you'd probably only do it just showing so half. Okay, so getting into the interesting bit. Yeah. So if we're going to calculate into individual risk, we're going to have to split this interaction length. So we've worked out what our hazard distance is. Yeah. So say we're only interested in the people inside buildings, so we're using the B31AS. Yeah. Potential impact radius. So we've got that 248 meters. Yeah. So we're going to say, okay, let's call it 250. So that means we've got an interaction length of 500 meters. 2 times the hazard distance. We're going to split that into sections or steps. Yeah? Pipeline joints tend to be 12 metres long, but it's much easier if you use tens. It's just the maths of it. 5 or 10 metres. Yeah, it's always this standard. You can do everything. They're not really over 12 metres long anyway. So, okay. So we've got our midpoint, got our transect. Yeah? So we've got worked out our interaction length. Split it into sections. And what we're going to do then, the reason we want reasonably small sections because we're going to take the midpoint as representative. We're going to say reality. We're going to take a point there. So you could do it every metre. You can do it every centimetre if you really want to. Just take it forever, especially by hand. But if you were doing it by computer, you could just say actually, what happens if it's every 20 metres, every 10 metres, every 5 metres? Is there any difference? For each step. Yeah, so we want to calculate the risk from here to somebody who is here, yeah? And then for that step and that step. So, and then you just add them all together, and we've got the risk for that point there. Yeah? And all you have to do is for the next point on the transect. So, not not difficult. We're going to come on to that in a second, but the point would be, so say you had a interaction length of 500 meters, and you split it into 10-meter sections, you would have 51 sections. And say the same thing, so you're going to do that calculation. So at each point of the transect, if you've got a transect's going to be 500 meters long as well, 250, so to measure your hazard distance. So that'd be 25 points, So we've got 25 points on the transect. And then we've got indoors and outdoors. And then do we then have day and night? Do we want different weather conditions? So we might use 5D and 2F for representing those things. I think they will be coupled. That's kind of mean the same sort of thing in each other. So you're doing what we're going to do is the second show. It's a very similar calculation, but you would have 51 times 25 times 2 times 2, maybe times another 2. This is it's doable by hand. This is boring. This is why computers are invented, to do repetitive calculations. So be thankful you weren't in this class 40 years ago, when everything you had to do by hand. Now, you're going to try and do it once, and then if you actually have to do it for real, you think it's probably easier. It's worth me spending the time learning how to do this and getting Excel to do it for me. Okay, so this is the equation that you would do. So it's very simple. Individual risk, F, the frequency of failure. Frequency of failure is per kilometre year. So then we need to know how long of the pipeline are we interested in. So each step's got that. Then we need to know, does it ignite? Because if we're talking about natural gas, it doesn't matter if it doesn't ignite. And we need to know what's the probability of ignition and the probability of being a casualty at this point Y away from the pipeline. So this last one's a bit more difficult to do, but the rest of it's fairly simple. There's just potentially a lot of them to come up with a risk transfer. Okay, and obviously, mathematically, what you get is that it's the sum between 1 to n. Okay, so I think if we're lucky, we get an example next. Okay, all right. No, this is the same point I'm trying to make here. You're going to repeat each failure type. Well, maybe we think about we're going to do leaks and ruptures. I would probably, if I was going to skip anything, I think we'll ignore the leak. People should be able to run away from the leak. But you've got all these various bits, so you've got potentially lots of those with the calculation. But this might be a casualty probability curve with distance from the pipeline. Again, going to be flat to begin with because you're going to be so dead, So and then it tails off. And you come to a point where you're guaranteed not to be a casualty. You will be safe if you were at this point. But it's normally relatively low for pipelines, and therefore it's not a very good decision-making tool. Most pipelines come out with very similar individual risk levels, regardless of how good or bad they are. So 1 times 10 to the minus 6, 1 in a million, is the HSE's broadly acceptable level. We'll later on. But below that, you're not bothered, and most pipelines tend to be around 1 or 2 times 10 to the minus 6. So they're all just into the tolerable if alarm region. So on the whole, we calculate individual risk. We tend not to make our decisions on individual risk. Obviously, if you did the calculation, you found this was up at 10 to the minus 2, way into the this is not acceptable ever level, then you might not bother with the next step of the calculation and probably go back and wonder where you've gone wrong. But, we don't tend to make decisions using individual risk for pipelines. Oh, it's just either side of the pipeline. So if you've got a pipeline, you've got north and south, or whichever, sorry. Yeah. Yes. This is just so Excel will plot it, because it doesn't do those kind of directions very well. So, for some reason, we always tend to draw the pipeline as running horizontally. So, you know, positive tends to be up and negative tends to be down, but in reality, the pipeline is going in any direction. It's a very good point, actually, that you normally find that if you've got the direction of flow, you will define X in that direction and Y like that. Yeah? So you can work out from the direction of flow which is the positive side and which is the negative side. But occasionally you can get bitten on the bum. We're dealing with a pipeline at the moment in Chile that was originally built in one direction, so it's referred to as the San Fernando to Maipu pipeline. The problem is now the flow's been reversed. The flow runs from Maipu to San Fernando. So when everybody says, oh, there's this problem at KP20, we're never quite sure whether it's 20 from San Fernando or 20 from Maipu anymore. You know, so we have to kind of, and when you get the ILI reports back, the ILIs have a log distance in them. So you get, but they obviously pushed by the flow, so the ILI data is all 0 at Maipu and 135 at San Fernando. Anyway, we're getting into all sorts of trouble with knowing where it is. You know, we go to look at the map saying, does this make any sense where that is? One of the things nowadays you get with ILI reports, you tend to get the XYZ coordinates from GPS. So we just look at the altitude. It's really good if the two ends of your pipeline are at different levels, then you can always make sure you've got it the right way around. Okay, a little example. If we had a rupture failure frequency of 150 per million kilometre years, and if you remember the little example I did of the big 36-inch 12.7, we've got 14. So this is, we're probably talking about slightly thinner pipeline, yeah? Or in somewhere where there's much less control over development. Ignition probability, well, let's say a third, 0.3, arbitrarily chosen because it multiplies by 150 quite well. So, and let's say we're going to have a very simple approximation for this casualty probability. So in reality, we're going to get something that looks like that, this S-curve, and we're just going to have a two-step bit here. We're going to say, if your casualty of being a probability, the probability of being a casualty is 1 between the pipeline and the building burning distance. Yeah? So if you're inside the building burning distance, then just there's no escape. You will be a casualty, which is back to the old B31AS big circle of death approach. Yeah? And then we're going to say after that. Well, it kind of depends on the amount of shelter, but we're going to say there's a 25% chance between the building burning distance and the escape distance that you're going to be a casualty. And we're going to assume that 90% of the time is spent indoors and 10% outdoors. Yeah? So this is somewhere in Northern Europe.
So we are assuming that the ignition voltage is 2.3, but it's not like in reality when you're doing such a calculation. How do you get such data?
Okay. There is an equation in TD2, IGM TD2, and you can find it in IPC papers that has ignition probability with related to pressure and diameter squared.
And the residence?
This is, well, you have to know where it is. So this would be a typical assumption for the UK and Northern Europe. If you were somewhere else, you would, you kind of have to know something about the, and it helps to, I quite often like to, if it's somewhere nearby, I'd go and visit the place I'm going to do an assessment for and have a little look around how, check there's not a school that I haven't spotted from the maps. If you're going to work out, if you're going to, at the end of the day, write a report that says, we think if the pipeline fails here, all these people are going to die, and it's okay, then sometimes it's better to go and see them, to know who they look like. It's very easy to sit in your office and just say, yeah, it's fine. But you've got to, so oil and gas pipelines are hazardous things. They do go bang occasionally, and they do kill people, and it's worth remembering that. Yeah? So, depends where it is. You have to make a judgment. You can repeat it. You could do it a different way, take different values and see how different the answer is. Is it sensitive or not? Especially if you're doing it by computer. If you're doing it by hand, you want to pick a value and just do it once. Yeah? But if you're going to do it by computer, you could say, okay, well, I wonder what would happen, Say this was the biggest heat wave Newcastle has ever seen, everybody spends all their time sunbathing outside. Problem, it's like, when would the pipeline fail? Would it fail in the summer or in the winter? What's the pressure likely to be in the summer compared to the winter? You start getting into all of those. We tend to average it all out. Okay, just a little summary. So, between 0 and 55 metres, indoors and outdoors, your cancer probability is 1, yeah? So, if you're 55 metres from the pipeline, you're dead. Sorry. Between 55 and 110 metres, if you're indoors, you're fine, yeah? Stay indoors, yeah? Don't go to the window. Yeah? Outside, you've got a 25% chance of not making it back indoors, yeah? Yeah, you were too far away from the house. So you were toast before you got back home. 25, yeah. So you've got 25% of dying, sort of thing. And it will be the slow and people who are sensitive to radiation, yeah. So this is going to be like old ginger people.
Sorry, it's 25% of not dying.
Of dying. So 25% chance of being a casualty. So 75% of you get away, yeah? So all you young guys who can run fast, you'll be fine, yeah? This will be like some Scottish grandpa. Yeah? Sort of really pale skin, very sensitive to radiation, and can't run very fast. If once you're beyond 110 metres, then you can just sit and watch your neighbours burn. Yeah, it's just guy with a broken leg. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you guys have got to decide. You make your own decisions. Do you go back and pick him up? You can. We try not to model moral behaviour in the models. We try and assume some sort of average values that cover all possibilities. We'll come on to that later. Okay, but remember that we said that the maximum distance to get a cavity is 110 metres, so our interaction length is 220. So we're going to go from -110 to +110, yeah? 0 at the point at where the transect we're interested in. Measure the distance from the transect to the centre of the step. So obviously that's 100 metres. Yeah? That's a 20. We say 20 metre steps, yeah. So the step goes from -110 to -90. The midpoint is at -100. Yeah? So if you're doing it by hand, make the maths easy. Sort of thing. Don't pick bizarre things that mean you've got to do more sums than you need to. Move the fire down the pipeline step by step. Yeah. So got our little equation for individual risk, very simple. So for y equals 0 and x equals -100, yeah? So this is the point. This is our pipeline here, and we've got our transect. We want to calculate the risk there. So at this point is x equals 0, and we're looking at the point at -100. So y equals 0, x equals -100. So for person indoors, yeah, we've got our Fairley frequency, 150 times 10 to the -6, yeah, 150 per million years. Our step length, 20 metres. Yeah, this is in kilometre years. Your step length tends to be metres. Make sure you do that right. Yeah? So 0.02. Yeah, ignition probability 0.3. But we're talking about a person indoors. If you remember back to that little table, indoors, you were only a casualty if you were within 55 metres. So 0 per year. Yeah, fine. Yeah. Outdoors, the same thing, except your casualty probability is 0.25. Yeah? So is there a small chance? Yeah, you will be a casualty. So, but of course, 90% of the time is indoors, only 10% is outdoors because this is rainy Britain. So we can't go out in case we melt in the rain. So actually, the risk for that one step. Yeah. So we're only talking about this one step here so far, yeah, we've calculated that value. We're going to have to do the same for all the other steps to get the risk here. Yeah? Ooh. We get the individual risk of the step is 2.25 times 10 to the minus 8. Is this clear? I know I'm rushing. There's quite a lot to get through, and I'm rushing through it quite a lot. You can email me later if you've got any questions afterwards. If you read it through and it just doesn't make any sense. Sorry?
Different values of the y.
Yeah. You then have to go. So we're doing it once. We've got one here. We've got to do it for all the other steps to get this point, and then we're going to have to do it all again for that point and that point and that point and that point and that point. Yeah. This is what Excel's for. Okay, so depth of cover varying would vary this, yeah? So we've assumed in this example that the fairly frequency is constant, which implies that the depth of cover is constant, which may be because you don't know anything about the pipeline yet. Somebody's come and said, do me a risk assessment, and you just had to assume it's a nominal depth of cover, and you don't actually have the depth. In reality, when we do this for real, yeah, what we do is we have the elevation of the pipeline, the depth of cover that varies, and so it calculates the frequency for each step as it goes along. Okay? So each time it does F, it's different, but that's way too complex for hand calculation. Okay, so but if we look at this, well, this is the basic data. Y equals 0, so we're a point on the pipeline. Fairly frequency is this, step length is this, ignition probability is that. You can create a little table. What's your x coordinate? What's your distance to point Y? What's your casualty probability if you're indoors? And therefore, what's your risk? What's your casualty probability if you're outdoors? And what's your risk? And therefore, 90% of that plus 10% of that. And you get all that. And then you add it all up, and we get 4.64 times 10 to the minus 6 per year. So, greater than the broadly acceptable level of 1 in a million. But still pretty low, not too bad. 10 to the minus 4 is where is the not acceptable level. So we've still got quite a way to go, 1.5 orders of magnitude. So, okay, you probably live with that. Remember that the chance of dying from anything is about 1 times 10 to the minus 2 per year. So when you look at that, the pipeline's only adding a small amount of additional risk to you. You heard the old joke about the Irish guy who heard that 90% of all accidents occur within 5 miles of home, so he moved house. Very, very, very old joke, and very bad. If you do this again for these different points, different bits of Y, as you said, you have to do it again for each Y. Yeah? You get this. So we've got our start one. Same value because there's no difference between 0 and 25. And remember, the first breakpoint in our casualty probability is at 55 meters. So we're going to expect similar. Yeah, we'll have a little effect of geometry because we've got slightly further away. So the amount of the pipeline that can affect us is less. You can plot a little individual risk transact. Looks like that. Easy. Yeah. We're just assuming the down is the same. Yeah. So this is. So you could, if you did down, it would be reflected the same. Yeah. Doesn't matter. It's the same on either side because we've not introduced anything that says differently. We could make it really sophisticated. We could say on the north side of the pipeline, it's all people who hate being outdoors, so they spend 100% of their time in the house. And on the south side of the pipeline, are people who've got big gardens, and so they spend much more time outside. We make it, and then you would have slightly different answers on both sides. But for a little hand cal, just assume, take the average. Again, when we do it for real, we put areas in and we say we give values to those areas of different shelter, density, different other parameters that influence the calculation. But we do that through a computer program. If I was doing it by hand, I would think, okay, what's going to be the average for this site as a whole? Why is it 0 at 125? That's too far. 110, yeah, 110 was our maximum distance we were interested in. So there was no point in doing that calculation. When we got to the bit that said y equals 125, we should just immediately wrote equals 0. There was no need to fill in that table. Yeah, I think I probably repeated all of you get the extra tables in the notes, which you can check. The last person who found an error in the mention notes got a job at Pensman. So that was some time ago, I think it was what he said. But you know, you can fill in a table, everything will be 0, all your casualty probability is 0, all your risk can be 0. So it's a little bit of a, but I do see that sort of thing in exams. Under exam pressure, people just fill in the table and just fill in, you know, you wait another 5 minutes, we could be doing another question.
So, are we going to have this question in the exam?
Something. Think about the course as a whole, yeah? The whole module. Some of the lectures are all about talking about things, and some of the lectures have sums, yeah? And in the exam, you get a bit of both. So you can kind of work out to a certain extent. So I always get asked, so can you do something with a calculation in it? So you will have to do some multiplication, at the very least in my questions. I think this time they've been split into, I think the questions are only 10 marks this time, I can't remember, it's different, slightly different exam format. I just emailed yesterday back to say I proofread them. I've got a draft copy of it, yeah. I think it's probably on my laptop. We talk morals and ethics later on about it. So yeah, so the exam has been written because they asked all the lecturers to proofread their questions to make sure that they'd copied them correctly from, because we send them in on Word and then they cut and paste them. And usually what they do is they format paste everything and get rid of all the superscripts, and so so you get a number that says 1.13 times 10 minus 7, and everyone's like, what does that mean? Yeah. We've done this every 25 metres. If instead we did it every 10 metres, we get a slightly more refined case, yeah? And now we do have a point at 110, which is our last point. Whereas before, our curve stopped at 100. So we didn't quite. Yeah? So, and you see here we got, you know, it was flat there, and then it started dropping because we've actually got flat 30 metres. It's kind of, you know. So you can get, you know, if we went to 5 metres, you might get a slightly different answer. But the peak should be the same. So it's just, but you have, again, you can see the two shoulders. Yeah? So we've got the indoors and outdoors, just outdoors. And because we said this 90%, 10%, yeah? So 100% of people can be affected here, only 10%. This is like an order of magnitude. So as a quick cross-check, you can think, okay, does it make sense? Yeah, these points are about a factor of 10 apart. That's about right, because this is everybody who's inside and outside, and this is only people who are outside. Any questions? Yeah. Shows the effect of indoor and outdoor casualty problems. If you see an individual transect that's just like a big upside down ball, a nice smooth curve, it means that ignore the difference between indoors and outdoors. And that, you know, if I was being critical, I would probably say to somebody that's a bit cracked. You can ignore one of the big key factors. Yeah, have you either assumed everybody's outside, nobody, you know, there's no shelter at all, or have you assumed everybody's inside, nobody ever spends any time outside? You know, either way, you're not really representing what's really happening. So you're good if you see an individual as transect for a pipeline. You want to see some little shoulder. You know, there's got to be some effect. So that was individual risk. Talk about societal risk now. More calculations, similar but slightly different. So, the societal risk is a risk from society's point of view, in theory. So, and there's much more societal concern over large incidents, yeah? So, totally acceptable that people die in road accidents all the time. Some countries are better than others at their road accident statistics, but everywhere you go, it tends not to be a big issue that there are traffic deaths. I don't know, maybe in India, you know, where the traffic's terrible. But I don't know if that's causing a problem. There's too many, people eventually say there's too many people dying on the road. We ought to do something about it. But on the whole, that's the level of risk you accept because everyone wants to drive, and everyone 70% of people think you're an above average driver, these kind of things. But as soon as you have a train or a plane accident, that causes a lot more. Yeah. So, even if you take the local news, if you watch Look North, it's only the first item on the news if it's been a big car crash with lots of vehicles. Yeah. If it's just one vehicle, and then if it's a slow day, they might put it at the end just before the video of the cats or something. But if there was a train or a plane crash, that would be the first item on the news, and probably on the national news, not just the local news. So, and societal risk is a measure of the relationship between the frequency of an incident and the number of casualties that will result. And again, there are all these formal definitions that come from the ICME, Institute of Chemical Engineers. But societal risk is the frequency and the number of people suffering from a specified level of harm, death again, in a given population from the realization of a specific hazard. So this is why we make decisions with societal risk a lot more, because a single event could affect a lot of people. Yeah, it's going to be different. A failure here is getting all these houses. A failure here is going to pick that's going to be a school, that's a part for a school. But a failure here is taking out the office buildings. So, and you can think, a failure here at night, well, you're going to burn down a school, but actually there's probably another caretaker there. There's nobody there at night. Yeah? Same with the office buildings, at night, like if you saw the Buncefield. Have you looked at Buncefield yet in this module? Sure, there's Buncefield was a big incident in Britain. A petrol tank overtopped and created a vehicle fire. But it happened, it went bang on first thing on Sunday morning, like 6 a.m. on Sunday. Took out a big office block, but of course it was empty. So nobody killed. I don't know how many more lectures you've got. I'm sure somebody must talk about that kind of stuff. Actually, there used to be, when we set up the course, there was somebody who talked about incidents. Piper Alpha, big kind of thing, Buncefield, Flixborough, and all the things that led to changing legislation. But the main thing about societal risk is the viewpoint from the pipeline out. Yeah? If the pipeline fails here, how many people do I affect? Not the view from you that stood there saying how much of the pipeline can affect me. It's about this one bit of pipeline right here, fails here, how many people do we get at once? So if you're the operator or the regulator, yeah, you're much more interested in this. Yeah? In the UK, the regulator wants to deal with societal risk, but it's only got criteria for individual risks, so they do all sorts of crazy things to try and bridge the gap. But we're gradually teaching them. And this is where we make decisions, because this can give us very different answers for different pipelines, because it depends much more on what's around the pipeline as well, whereas the individual risk assumes there's somebody always there, so you get a similar answer for, that individual risk assumption that there's somebody always there blurs out some of the differences between pipelines. Okay. Ooh. But why that's diagram. We tend to only do this for areas of high population. Yeah? So class location changes. Yeah? So in many codes, pipeline codes, once you've built the pipeline, you have to review the number of people who live near it at regular intervals and determine whether your design basis is still correct. Yeah. So if the amount of population changes, then you built it as class 1, now it's class 2. Or maybe somebody says, Mr. Operator in Dubai, you built your pipelines in the desert 20 years ago, and now the Dubai is there. We want to build a 45-story hotel next to your big gas pipeline. Yeah. And they'll be like, well, is it going to be okay or not? Yeah. And you might do a societal risk assessment then. Yeah. But you don't tend to do them as a matter of, for everywhere. You do them at specific locations. Interaction for sites is slightly different. In reality, it's like this. Yeah? You take the last building last house or whatever it is, and you calculate the hazard distance, and you get it. But it's just easier to just do it like this, rather than doing the geometry. Just assume that, you know, take your village or your town or whatever, and add a hazard distance on the end. Yeah? It does mean in your first step here, you might get 0 casualties because you're too far away from anyone. But it's much simpler just to do it that way. It saves you having to, especially as most pipelines, in most countries, pipelines don't stay straight for long enough. They're always, because there is a built-up town and you have to go around it, so it gets all a bit of a mess. Yeah? We present societal risk as an FN curve, yeah? And the unfortunate thing is, they have a tendency to look quite a lot like the individual risk transect, yeah? In that they tend to you get bumps in them as well, yeah? Or you can do. Yeah? But the axes are different. So for individual risk, this is distance from the pipeline, and this is individual risk per year. For cycle risk, this is number of casualties, when I say casualties, I mean dead people. And the frequency causing N or more casualties. So this is why this curve always should be going downhill, because it's always N or more. And that also, because this where N equals 1, it's a lot plot. This is not the same as the individual risk because it's 1 or more, whereas the individual risk is the risk to 1. So they don't have the same value. We also need to specify a length that the FN curve relates to. Essentially, there's an acceptable amount of risk per unit length of pipeline. We typically use 1 mile or 1.6 kilometres because it matches the acceptance criteria. But if, say, you've only got a site that's 800 metres long, then should you be using 1.6 kilometres worth of risk allowance, or do you want to get half of it? And we tend to assume that you're only allowed half of it. You can't sterilise a little bit of land here. You might not own the next bit of land. So say there's a pipeline. We've got a pipeline. We've got two fields. Up there. 800. Each of these is 800 metres long. Yeah. And developer A wants to build a massive tower block. And that might say that's acceptable because there's nothing here. But if you do build that, then you'll never be able to build anything here. So if all this land was owned by the same person, they might decide that we're okay with that. They're going to make this into a park or something. But if this belongs to somebody else, then do you allow the first person? So, and kind of in the UK, we're tending to take a slightly more socialist view of this, and you're not allowed. You get your bit, and you've got to leave the bit for there. In other countries, they might say, well, the first guy there, So if this is Trump Tower, then in America, they might say, well, who cares about the neighbours? But because of that, you would multiply it. You would make sure that you matched your acceptance criteria. You can either move your acceptance criteria to match your assessment, or move your assessment to match the criteria. So, I think this is a pipeline we looked at in the first lecture. Because that looks very familiar. Well, this looks familiar. Okay, so we've got a X60 pipeline, not too thick, 9.62 mil. There's a big, fairly frequency from third-party damage. There's a big, about 11 mil. It starts getting a lot better. So it's really high below 11 mil, and after 11 mil, it gets a lot lower. So probably got a bit of a problem with third-party damage. MEOP 85 bar, designed as class 1, but now it's class 3. Interaction length 1.33 kilometres. So we've multiplied. So this is slightly factored up from the values we calculated. There's a school for 38 pupils, and there's 20 residential dwellings, a total of 105 people. And we managed to predict that if you had a failure, you would kill, the worst case, you would kill 57. So is that okay? Do you want to know where it is? Yeah, about half of them. Yeah, we're predicting we're going to kill about half of them. I mean, what we've got is we'll have a range of events, yeah, because If we've got our school surrounded by little houses, etc., then obviously the worst point of failure might be there. So at that point, we might get 57. If we had a failure here, we might only get 5. And that's, we'll do the assessment. We do start a risk in a second. What we'll do is when we move it down the pipeline, we're looking at different numbers of casualties we get each time. So the worst frequency, the worst N max, maximum number of casualties, 57. So is it acceptable? Do we consider the other half of them lucky? We come on to. Sorry?
If it's half, I think it's okay. But you should have some mitigation there.
So does it matter where it is? Do you want to know where it is in the world?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real case. This is a real piece of work I've done. This is actually in Colombia, in South America. And the reason there is now it was a class 1 and now it isn't is because when they built the pipeline through the jungle, they cleared an area of land to build the pipeline, makes it a nice road for people to drive up and down, so now there's a village.
So it can't be get to 1.5.
That's the total number of people who live in the area we're interested in is 105. Yeah? So what happened was that the pipeline company did a survey and said, oh, this bit of pipeline that we designed is class 1. There's now this village here that makes it class 3. What do you think we should do? Should we move the village? Should we go and shoot all the people? Or, didn't ask us that. So I guess that's old Colombia. New Colombia is much friendlier. Or should we relay the pipeline? Or should we put down concrete slabs? What can we do? Is the risk acceptable to these people or not? Do we have to do anything? That's what the question they asked us. But we'll come on to how we make that judgment. You've got your own, you get your own view. These are indigenous populations. These are essentially First Nations, Canadian term, sort of Indians, as it were, rather than. So does that make a difference? In Colombia at the moment, it does because they're trying to protect these populations, who've been discriminated against for years. So the government is trying to make things better for them. So that's it's very politically sensitive. If you had a pipeline failure that took out a native village, it's not going to go down. You might lose your license to have one. So that's just complicating matters. We concentrate on doing the sums. Come on to it later. So how do we work out societal risk? We've got our interaction length. We can work out our big circle of when buildings burn. For each step in the interaction length, we're going to do the same thing, split the interaction length into steps. For each step, we've got to work out what the frequency is. So, it depends on the wall thickness, the depth of cover, all of those things. Yeah? And the number of casualties. Yeah? And we call these little f and little n. Yeah? And this is an FN pair. Yeah? So for each step in the interaction length, you get an FN pair. And because frequency is a little bit, it's the frequency of causing casualties. So the frequency has got to include the probability of ignition in it. Yeah? So in individual risk terms, it would be the F term, the DX term for the length, yeah? And the rho I. Yeah? So you've got those bits go in the frequency and the casualty probability goes in the number of casualties. So it's similar to the individual risk, but not quite the same.
So in such an area, how do you choose your data position? Where you're going to transit?
Oh no, we're not doing a transit now, we're going to do an FN curve. So we're going to move the fire all the way along the interaction line. Now we're going to draw a picture that gives us an FN curve that represents the whole development. So we will also pick somewhere, what we would also do is do the individual risk, and what we'd probably do is pick where we think it's going to be highest. So that would be, or through through a representative area. So we may just say, oh, here will do. Draw a line there, that gives us the individual risk that's typical for this area. it would depend on the shelter density. So you would get, if we drew the transect here where it was empty and there was no shelter, we'd get a higher individual risk than if we did it here where there was more shelter. So we would have to try and pick somewhere. And that's another reason why you can play tunes with individual risk and get slightly different answers. Another reason why we don't like making decisions with it, because you can cheat. Whereas it's much harder to cheat this size of risk. But you've got to count all the people you've killed or you're predicted to kill. If we go through it, calculate the FM pairs for each section of the interaction length here. And then we've got to order them in order of ascending n. Yeah? So for each step, so say you've got 20 steps, step 1 to 20, you've got a frequency, you've got a number of people you've predicted to kill. And what we want to do is order them so we start with the lowest. Yeah? So where are the sections that only have no casualties, and then 1 onto the 57. Yeah? And then we're going to sum all the values of f for each different n. Okay, so if we have 5 sections where we can kill 5 people, well, that adds up to the same frequency of 5. Yeah? Or if the frequency of 5 killing 5 people, which is what we want. And then we do this cumulative sum because it's n or more. So this doesn't make half as much sense as individual risk, but this is just the way it is. This is how you get to the FN curve. And then you plot it as a curve. It's only 5 steps. Yeah? Not that hard to do, but just again a little bit of manipulation. And we've got a little example here. New development near the pipeline, 8 dwellings, 5 people per dwelling, probably a bit, certainly over the top for the UK. UK pipeline codes suggest you can take 3 as an average per house, but you can also or use census data. We've got a small office building with 50 people in, and assume that everyone's there. We're just going to make it simple. No day and night, no moving. Just assume it's the same. So no one gets to go home from work. Yeah? So this is the Pensped office.
No one gets home.
No. So actually, I think I was the last person to leave the office last night, having printed these notes out, and that was about 8 o'clock. So we get to go home eventually. Okay, so we had a little bit like this, 8 dwellings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, yep, and a little office block. Yeah. And we've got a nice little grid, it's a nice simple set of geometry. We've got these data, once again, chosen suspiciously so that they multiply through to nice round numbers. Failure frequency 40, collision probability 0.25, hazard distance 100 metres. Yeah? And we're going to make it even simpler on casualty probability. We're not going to look at indoors and outdoors this time. We're just going to say, basically, if you're less than 100 metres from the pipeline, you're dead. If you're more than 100 metres, you're going to survive. Make it nice and simple. And we're only going to do a step every 25 metres. Yeah? So yeah, basically this. Yeah? This is black or white, basically. Great. In reality, it's a graduated scale with distance, and you can do the models help you work out that. They don't tend to present it. You just build it for the calculation. But effectively, you've got this graduated, this flat bit where everyone's dead, and then it tilts on. It's not a step like this. But So move the fire down the pipeline. Count the number of people who are casualties for each step. 0. Yeah. Step 1. You've got frequency, but the number n is 0. Yeah? You're not getting anyone. Yeah. Remember, we've got that's at 100, and we said the interaction length was 100. So we took the point of the last house and added 100 on. But we know with that simplistic. In reality, we should be looking at 100, which would probably be somewhere right here. Here, and you can see, we've got 1 there, 2, 3 houses, maybe more, and the office block. We'll go back, 1, 2, 3, is that 5 houses? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one on the tangent, well, obviously, we've not drawn it very well, have we? If we're representing everything as a point, that guy just escapes. And the office block, so we've got 5 buildings and the office block, so that's 75 people. 50 in the office block, 5 in each house, 5 houses. Yeah. Here, just the last house. So, yeah, easy. Yeah. So, in the I've done this in the past where you get an acetate, you know, an acetate, like a clear sheet of transparency sheet, yeah? And you draw the circle on of your distance, and then you just move it down the strip maps. You know, back before when we used to get paper strip maps rather than digital strip maps, and you just move it down, thinking, okay, where's the place I should be worried about? Where's the area that's got the most number of people in it? And that's when I work out where I do my assessment. Because back in the day, when everything used to come on paper. Okay, so if we did that, yeah, we would get something like this. Yeah? And we've done quite enough. I must have missed a house somewhere in that one. So we had 6 houses. We've got our x-coordinate of our step. We've got our frequency. So again, we've said the frequency of ignition. We're going back to, you know, we've got these values for the step: 25 meters times 4 times 40 times 10⁻⁶ times 0.25. We're ignoring the variation you would get with depth of cover, and we're assuming the wall thickness is the same, and there's no bits of thicker or thinner wall, which you would normally take account of in a real case. And we've counted the number of people who are going to be casualties at each step. Yeah. And then, so that's first step. Do that. Yeah. Just drawing a circle, counting people inside the circle. Then we've got to order them in order of ascending n. So. Yeah. Number of casualties n. Ooh. What's going off at the bottom here? Those should be dropped off. No, that's the sorry. Okay, that's what we started with, and what we end up is that. Yeah. I think I've made this simpler. Last year it just went straight to the new answer, but now it's like so. This is where you start with this, and this is what you get to in step 2. Step 3, we sum all the values of different FN pairs, yeah? So we've got three sections with 0, 1 with 5, 3 with 10. So what we end up with is something like this, yeah? That makes sense, that last step? Yeah. Almost there now. So again, none of this is very difficult mathematics. It's just a little bit laborious. Then we've got a cumulative sum. Yeah? So we start with 0, but we're going to drop the 0. We'll come back to that in a second. But if we want to know the number of casualties where it's 5 or more, then it's the sum of all of this. So the frequency of getting 5 casualties or more, yeah, at least 5 casualties. So 2.5 plus 7.5 plus 2.5, 2.5. And so you end up with 2.5 times 10⁻⁶. The frequency of getting at least 10, yeah, 10 or more, well, it's that minus this number, isn't it? Because you then only adding these ones. And then you get to that, and that one, to that. So, and obviously 80, the last point should be the same in both because there is no other data. Why did we drop the 0? Why didn't we drop that 0 point? There's 2 reasons. Don't look at, looking ahead to see if I've written it down. You're on the next slide. Shocking. Very shocking. Okay. One of the things is, remember when we looked at the interaction length and we said we're going to take the points of the last houses and just add the interaction length on, knowing that would give us some areas that would always be 0. We would always have a, you know, it was a simplistic assumption. But we could have made that, we could have started 50, another 100 metres away if we wanted to. So the amount of 0 is kind of a little bit arbitrary. You know, if this was the only development in a 100-kilometre pipeline, then you could assess the whole 100 kilometres and you have lots of 0. So that's one of the reasons why it doesn't really make any sense to use the 0, because that's the bit you can cheat with in a cyclist system. And the other bit is we're going to present this on a log-log plot, and plotting 0 in a log plot is something that Excel refuses to do. We discard the 0, yeah? So we don't add, yeah? So this, although we've got 7.5 times 10⁻⁷, we could almost make this number anything we wanted, which would skew the rest of the analysis. Yeah? So we discard the zeros. And so what we get is we've now got this nice little table where the numbers get smaller as the n, so f gets smaller as n gets bigger. You want it all to be going that way the whole way, monotonically decreasing in mathematic terms. And we get a plot that looks like that. Fantastic, yeah? Now we start at 1, the base of our graph is 1, yeah? And we haven't actually got a point because we didn't have one person on their own. Yeah? If we'd have had, if we'd have had defined the population better, or maybe had during the day only the mother stays at home, let's be sexist about it, the man goes to work, the children go to school, or the other way around, the man stays at home, but maybe there's only one person in the house in the daytime, and at night time there's 5, then you would have a point with 1 on. But because of that, and because this is the number of, it's the frequency of n or more, effectively it's the same as 5. Yeah, it's flat at that point, because 1 or more is the same as 5 or more, because you can't. Yeah? Does that make any sense? Yeah. You can't really get. We haven't predicted 1, but the frequency of getting 1 or more is the same as the frequency of getting 5 or more, because really the first point is 1. So it's common practice just to draw a horizontal line back from your first point to 1. The other bit is, of course, in reality, this could be a vertical line. The frequency is, basically it's like a cliff edge at this point, but we tend not to plot that. Again, another little simple calculation method that you could do by hand and maybe asked to do by hand shortly. Enough of a clue. Alternative ways, so that and the individual risk calculation are 2 kind of hand calcs. And these are real calculations. We've simplified them. We do them much more complex in reality. We include depth of core, we include different wall thicknesses, different grades. We look at the we plot the pipeline in the real geometry. We do all those things. We look at different people's movements day and night. In fact, we probably look at a week as a whole and look at how everything varies over the week. Split it up maybe into 8 different time periods. So essentially we're doing the assessment 8 times and then taking that all into account. Obviously, if you were going to do it by hand, you just spend longer. You could do a reasonable and simplest assessment like a first pass by hand, not too bad, and first pass by Excel really easily. Once you've got, if you counted the number of houses in the circle and put that into Excel, then it's easy. It's really easy then just to do the formatting to get the FM plot, no problem. So, any questions on societal risk, calculating societal risk? So I say, read through the steps. Don't worry about it, it doesn't make any sense. It just is what somebody decided is how we were going to do it, and everyone has agreed that's how we're going to do it. Alternative ways of presenting risk. So we talked about this before, potential loss of life. You get this a lot. If you read a safety case for an offshore platform, you will always have the potential loss of life will be one of the headline figures. Yeah? So it's a measure of the average number of fatalities per year. Yeah? So you really hope it's less than 1. If you're working on if you ever have to work offshore, then and you get the chance to see the safety case before you go. If the number's more than 1, it's probably not good work in the environment. We don't really want to predict it. You're definitely going to kill someone on average every year. Should be a low number. Yeah. When it happens, it might be a lot of people at once, but you want it to happen not very often. So your average is small. And it's the sum of the individual risk for the exposed population from various points on the site. So you get this. Yeah. The individual risk at the drilling deck times the number of people at the drilling deck, times the fact that they're only there for 12 hours a day. So. Number of people in the accommodation, heli deck, you can split them. Same with a process plant, you could have people working on plant A, plant B, control room, canteen, car park, work it all out, and then you end up with a potential loss of life. Another thing that we get is called expectation value, and we use that a lot in cost-benefit analysis. And again, it's a statistical expression of the average number of fatalities per year. And the way we do it is we sum these FM pairs. Before we've done the cumulative bit, if you sum that up, then you get, or you sum the product of the FNPS, then you get this thing called expectation value, and it's analogous to the potential loss of life. It's just done in a slightly different way. Under the right conditions, you know, an expectation value like this, sum of F times N is equal to IR times N. But we use this a lot. Yeah? Another reason why we want to put it into Excel, because then it can do the multiplying the F by the N and adding them all up for you and give you your expectation value. Okay, some key points to remember. With both individual sites risk, you've got to compare like with like. Yeah? So, you know, if people are asking you to compare two pipelines or compare a pipeline with an acceptability criteria, you've got to know that they were calculated in the same way. So for individual risk, those are things like, are we assuming there's 100% residents? You know, so are you assessing your pipeline where you've assumed someone's always there against a process plant where there's nobody, where you've taken into account the fact that the people who work 8 hours a day, sort of thing, 8-hour shift or whatever, and therefore you automatically got a factor of 3 in there. You know, have you included the exposure, which is the, you know, whether they're there or not. Societal risk, you know, what hazards are we including? You know, so for natural gas, then it probably makes very little difference. You have to be virtually on top of the pipeline when it leaks for you to be killed. You just, you know, even with the way when we do the assessments, we assume a bit of thinking time, which we're going to come on to. Yeah? And but for a toxic pipeline or a heavier than air, like an LPG, then leaks are more important. So you want to know is have you assessed both leaks and ruptures? You know, how long has the pipeline been assessed? You know, one of the things that's hard, most QRA reports never tell you that, and therefore you're never quite sure whether they've compared it to the criteria. This is TD2. This is one of my favourite standards in the world because I wrote this. Actually, I helped write it. I was on the committee that wrote this. A nice little document, lovely pink colour, like all IGM standards for transmission and distribution of. Okay. Developed by what at the time was called the Risk Assessment Working Group of the UK Onshore Pipeline Operators Association. This is now, we've reorganised the working groups. It's now the Faults and Risk Working Group, and I'm the chair. And we updated it. There's edition 2, so we did some updates after some people. So we issued the first one. People went off and used it, and then said, actually, you know, page 47 doesn't make any sense to us. Which meant that we kind of then sort of said, well, if you don't understand it, you shouldn't be using it. This was meant to be guidance for experienced practitioners, not meant to be for beginners. So what we were trying to do was make sure everyone was doing the same thing, rather than teach people how to do it from the beginning. Yeah. Based on established best practice. So how did the industry calculate these things? Yeah? What did they take into account? Yeah? And therefore guidance for competent practitioners. Yeah? And it's partly so we could move our decision. We were discussing a lot of things with the regulators, yeah? And we wanted to talk about what was acceptable risk, yeah? Not how to do the calculations. We wanted to park this, just say, look, this is these are the methods and methodologies, the models, the assumptions we use. We're going to stick with these. If you stick with those, what's acceptable? How many people are we allowed to kill? Where do we draw the line? And that's what we wanted to start. We wanted to push the regulator. And so for 20 years, we've been having discussions with the health and safety executive. You know, so when I started this, I used to be the graduate engineer who took the minutes of these meetings, and now I'm the person sort of hammering on the desk saying, for God's sake, we've been talking about the same thing for 20 years. So we wrote this as a way to say, once it's published as a standard, there's nothing they can do about it. They weren't happy. Tough shit. Now we get to talk to them about what's acceptable, because this has been parked to a certain extent. So it's only applicable for natural gas. It's got some recommended event trees. Did we talk about event trees in the first lecture? I don't remember. It was a long ago. And I've done my subsea lectures in between now, so I'm kind of all mixed up as to what course I'm delivering. And it talks about how to do failure frequency assessment. So it has some historic operational data from the UK in tables. It has some generic failure frequency curves, which I think we might talk about in a minute. And then it sort of says, if you're going to predict, you should include these things when you do it. It doesn't tell you how to do the predictions, but kind of, it does give you some references, but it sort of says, if you're going to do prediction, include these things. And it talks again about consequence assessment. It says, you know, do a transient release rate, has ignition probability model, gives you some thermal radiation values. You know, in the consequence assessment, the TDU values, 1800 for a normal person, 1050, 1060 for sensitive elements, people with a bad leg. And it's got a risk criteria in it. Okay. There is an equivalent, oh dear, that's terrible. Equivalent published document for non-methane pipelines. So PD8010, what used to be BS8010, British standard now has to be overruled by European standards, so it's a published document. Yeah? And it's got a much less snappy title. And there's a new version of that, written in parallel, so we wrote the two together. And it's got a much wider range, yeah? So it covers all the other things that a major accident has in pipelines. Gasoline and toxic fluids are excluded. Toxic because it was too hard. Gasoline because in the UK legislation it's not actually defined as a major accident hazard pipeline. It's a little bone of contention with the HSE, but they got missed off in the first drafting of the legislation. And it's got slightly different risk criteria. And it accounts, it doesn't sort of, I think there's another slide in a second that shows that. But this one accounts for the fact you might get a drifting dense gas cloud, you know, from an LPG release. So your casualties may not be close to the pipeline. You know, with a methane release, then all your casualties have got to be within that 250 metres, say you calculated from the pipeline. If you've got an LPG release, if it doesn't ignite locally and it goes wandering off down the valley, blown by the wind or slumping with gravity, then the casualties might be in the nearest tank, not actually where the pipeline is. And there's a slightly different, the length of acceptable risk is different for both of them. For reasons that caused us to argue for about 3 months until everyone got bored and just let the guy run his 1 kilometre at Abbey. We don't care anymore. So, quantitative risk assessment, it's an absolute measure of risk, which means allows you to judge it against other everyday risks. It's meant to be objective. You know, there are little bits of subjectivism, things like residency periods that you build in, but you know, if you're writing a QRA report, you document all of that so somebody else can say, well, I don't agree with that, or if I could repeat the analysis myself. But it needs specialist software, models, expertise, time consuming, and so we only tend to use it for specific areas. Yeah? So location class change is the big one. Some land use planning applications, so somebody wants to build something near your pipeline, and then occasionally bits that you're just worried about. Might be because you're worried about the integrity. You're thinking, we know we've got an integrity problem there and we're not going to be able to fix it for the next 3 years. So what risk level are we putting the people nearby on? You might just do that assessment yourself and say, okay, it's pretty high, maybe we ought to, we go back to management in the company, get the budget released early so we can fix the pipeline this year, not in 3 years' time. But if you're going to do a risk assessment of a whole pipeline, then you use qualitative or semi-quantitative methods. Is that on the first clause? Very, very rapidly through this calculation. I'm now going to finish off with what is acceptable risk. So, that's what we said we were going to talk about, so I'm going to get back on. So remember, we've now finished risk analysis. Done the first job as either, either with the safety department or the operator or the consultant. You've done the analysis. Now it probably goes up to somebody else to say, okay, is that okay or not? So how do we assess acceptability? Yeah. So this is the first. This is classic safety. Where there's a hazard, it means there's a chance that something undesirable may happen. So our pipeline's a hazard. There's a chance it might go bang. So if we want to eliminate the risk, we have to eliminate the hazard. Yeah. Which means, well, don't have a pipeline. Well, that's lovely, except it puts all of us here out of a job. So, and it turns the lights off. Yeah? It's kind of, So basically, if there is a hazard, you have to accept some level of risk, and we have to work out how much we accept. So we know that risk is a combination of probability and consequence, so it's obvious for us to think that you will accept a low probability of occurrence where the consequence is high. Yeah? So this is like the society being unhappy about train and plane crashes. So they don't like lots of people being killed at once. Yeah? So they want that to happen less often. But when it's a car crash where it's just one at a time, they can accept it happening more often. Does that make sense? You'd be happy with that? Yeah? High consequence, we want it to happen less often. Low consequence, you know. And if the consequence is really minor, you know, then it doesn't matter how often it happens. What's acceptable means, you know, is also based on what we're going to gain by taking the risk, and to a certain extent, the general level of exposure to risk in a society as well. This is where it gets very political about areas of the world. Yeah? So most international oil companies tend to say, no, we're going to use the values we use in US and Western Europe, we're going to use them everywhere. You may be cynical about whether they really do that, but that's what they state. Yeah, they don't think, you know, well, it's okay because risk levels in this country, you know, are terrible. Like, you know, nobody makes it past 50 anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But in life, in real life, sometimes people accept risk because they have no choice. So. So why do 5 people ride on one moped? Yeah. You've only got one moped. You don't have a car, so you will. Nice safety baseball cap as well. And actually, I'm not sure. They look like trainers. I'm not disappointed that they on safety flip flops as well. And this is another real photo. You know, why is this kid raking through the trash in the dump? Because there's no other way of making any money. We're going to find bottles and cans and sell them. So, and this is the bit, you know, obviously these kids take quite a risk, but we do really want to operate your pipeline saying, well, if that risk is acceptable in that society, and I think this is somewhere in Latin America, does that mean we can have pipelines that fail more often in this country because, well, nobody gives a crap. You know? Poor kid doesn't get to go to school, he has to go and rake through the trash looking for spare cans and bottles, yeah? Doing the recycling. So this is recycling. You know, in the UK, you have to recycle by putting things into the right bin and leaving it on the street. Yeah. In a lot of countries, you throw everything in one thing, and then kids learn a living by raking through it afterwards. But if you're the pipeline operator, these moral and ethical decisions. Yeah? Do you want to? This got a bit serious, didn't it? All my joking about we only count the dead people, but this is really, you know, do you really want to set a pipeline risk acceptable level differently in this country because this happens to Newcastle where everyone politely puts everything in the blue bin on a Wednesday, every second Wednesday. Actually, it's only Wednesday where I live, Chambers. So most international oil companies and most have now decided, you know, try and set a global set of rules that they try and apply. So small things. Who was the smoker? In my other lecture, there's much more about taking the piss out of the smoker. The one for subsea, that really, we got a town on there. Smoking is a voluntary risk. Yeah? You've decided to smoke yourself. You know, it may have been because you wanted to hang out with the big guys, or you thought that it would attract girls. You know, you were going to look cool. You've been practicing that special smoking stance, you know, all the time. Yeah. Whereas most people living near the pipeline is involuntary. You're not, you know, if you've got a transmission pipeline running past your house in the UK, you must live somewhere rural. You're probably a little farmer. Well, the farmer probably doesn't have gas because you might have an 85 bar pipeline at the bottom of the field, but there's not a 35 millibar plastic pipe coming to it because he lives too far away from everywhere else. So he's taking that risk but not getting any benefits. Yeah? You could say if you've got gas central heating, you're getting some benefit of there being a gas network. But this, of course, smoking got a bit interesting because then we decided that actually, if you smoked, you didn't just kill yourself, you could kill other people with the smoke. So now you have to, you know, like so Newcastle is got some of the fastest smokers in the world because you've got to go outside, yeah, straight back in, 30 seconds done, yeah. Yeah. So, you know, presumably if you live somewhere hot, you get to smoke in a much more relaxed fashion. So, yeah. So in Europe, I don't know, is there anyone live in a country where it's still acceptable to smoke indoors? Anyone got been anywhere? But I can remember people smoking on planes. And it was like you came off like a kipper. You were absolutely, the plane, you could look on a long flight, you could see like the cloud of smoke getting lower and lower. Seriously. Especially, I went on a flight from Spain in the morning from Zaragoza to Barcelona, 8 AM flight. Everybody in the bar in the thing drinking a tiny coffee and eating a churro, like a donut. And then everybody got on the plane, and everyone but me smoked a cigar. Got to Barcelona feeling very sick. So you're not allowed to do that anymore. We've said that killing yourself is okay, you can smoke outdoors, but you're not allowed to smoke indoors because you're passing that risk on to other people. So this is the general, this thinking about, you can't impose a risk on somebody else without them choosing. So we have this bit about that if you're taking the risk, you get to set the risk acceptance levels. Yeah? So if you want to take the risk of rock climbing, then you want to do rock climbing. That's fine. As long as you don't fall on anyone else, then it's just your risk. Yeah? So, but we get a big problem where if the people who make the gain from something that's risky aren't the people who are taking the risk. So we can have this little chart. Yeah. So if you decide to smoke outdoors, you're taking the risk, you're getting the gain by looking cool for those 30 seconds while you're shivering in the wind in Newcastle. And you get to decide whether to do that or not, yeah? I mean, once you've started, you've probably gone, psychologically and physically addicted to it, you'll never give up. So I think you might as well just work out who you're going to leave your money to in the class now. If it's involuntary, so if I'm the person stood next to you indoors, having to breathe in all your smoke, I'm taking the risk, but you're the one looking cool, yeah? And so what we have is the regulators on our behalf have now said that's not acceptable anymore. And if it's societal risk, so say this is like by running a gas network, they're running the infrastructure national grid, but those pipelines go past everybody's, go down the street, lots of old cast iron mains that are full of holes, you wander around bits of Newcastle, you'll be able to smell gas. They gradually replace the plan to replace every cast iron pipeline in the UK by 2032. So we've got another 15 years of them potentially going bang before it's all done. Who's making the game? Well, National Grid. Well, me a little, because I used to work for British Gas, so I've got some shares in National Grid, from the day, so I get a little bit of money if they do well, But who's deciding what's acceptable? Again, we've got regulatory rules that tell us what an acceptable risk from our pipeline is. So it's a quite simple concept, but it's very powerful. And this is in the whole theory of risk acceptance is don't impose risk onto people. They've got, if you do that, you've got to set some acceptable levels, or they've got to have the choice to either accept it or not accept it. So, you can make little choices. When I go on the train, I always sit facing backwards because it's much more survivable in a crash. I've been on 2 helicopters in my life because I look at the statistics, helicopters are terrible. So people say, my wife says, how come you've worked in the oil and gas industry for 25 years and you've only been offshore twice? It's bloody dangerous. So, I go the one who gets the reports back, So you can make some little life choices to make your life less risky. Like deciding to give up smoking before you're too late.
So you're saying that flying helicopter is risky?
Yeah.
But
Helicopters are much more risky than planes. Yeah, if the engine stops in a plane, then what you're in is now a glider. Yeah. If the engine stops in a helicopter, what you're in is a stone. Yeah?
So it means that our HEC were lying then.
Yeah, probably. But also, anyone who's been on a helicopter? Yeah, they're bloody noisy. They're really horrible. They're not really comfortable anyway. I always thought, when I was a kid, I thought it would be like Magnum PI. We'd be swooping around Hawaii in a little helicopter up front solving crimes. Now you get on a helicopter with work and you have to put on a big rubber suit and get deafened and put earplugs in, sit next to a guy who's too fat to get out the window. So if you do have land in the sea, you're going to die anyway. Not great. Anyway, very quickly, hopefully. Actually, perhaps not, we've got a bit to go on. For pipelines, we've got environmental hazards as economic hazards. For those two, the people who are exposed to the risk don't make the gain. Yeah? So if you're a shrimp fisherman in Louisiana, you weren't making anything out of BP's Deepwater Horizon well, but when it failed, you lost your livelihood. Economic hazards, well, that BP made that choice. They may have made it badly, they may not really have understood the risk they were taking, but they cut the corners to save some money and took a big risk and lost them a lot of money in the long term. So, and up here we think society sets risk assessment level regulation, and they tend to compare it with general levels. Yeah? And down here, it's up to you. Yeah? Takes your money, pays your choice. You know, well, takes your choice, pays your money. It gets like a gamble. Okay. So, risk acceptance criteria for these things. In the UK, we have this figure of unacceptable 10 to the minus 4. This is 10 times less than the historical fatality rate for the worst jobs in the UK, yeah? Which at the time were deep sea fishing or offshore oil and gas extraction in the North Sea. So they said, okay, if you're a worker, at least you're getting some benefit from that risk, but we'll make sure that people are only exposed to it a factor of 10 less than. So and then from there they said, okay, well let's set a value of no concern at 10 to the minus 6. And you can get this from at some point back in the dim and distant time, probably before most of you were born these days, there was a public inquiry about a new nuclear power station, and the HC was told to state what the criteria were, but actually publish it for the first time. And they published it in this document called the tolerability of risk. And you get this kind of curve, yeah? Up here, bad, not allowed, must fix it. Down here, broadly acceptable for normal people, definitely acceptable for everyone, even the people with the bad legs. And in the middle is this cost-benefit area where really it's, we call this the tolerable area, but it's tolerable only if the risks are as low as reasonably practical. I'm going to skip over that, it's not really too interesting here. For cycle risk, we have acceptable levels published in TD1 from edition 4 onwards and now in TD2. This was derived by assessing all the pipelines that British Gas had built in 30 years. And at that point, they'd not managed to kill anyone with a transmission pipeline. So they said, well, that risk must be okay. And they produced an envelope of acceptable risk. And therefore it assumes that all pipelines previously designed, built, and operated to that code are implicitly acceptable. Yeah. It's kind of a big jump, but you have to start from somewhere. And we get this TD1 curve. So it's slightly flatter, it's based on a straight line, but you've got flatter here and you've got steeper here. So this is the bit about making it harder for more casualties. If we don't like this is called aversion, why that graph gets steeper. The PD8010 line is there, but remember they're based on this. The black line is on 1.6 kilometres and the red line is 1 kilometre. So in reality they don't line up. We just present them as though they do. So, and what we can do then is we can plot our FN curve against that criteria. So this is back to this little village in Colombia I mentioned before. That's with the 57 casualties. So the red line is where we were originally. And what we did was we looked at, well, what if we put down concrete slabs? Or what if we relaid and thicker wall? And we can... Very similar. So putting the slabbing down. So third-party damage is the key failure frequency we're interested in. So both of those will prevent third-party damage or reduce third-party damage. We're getting very similar answers. And we're now inside this code, in this curve. So on that sense, yeah, well, we've reduced the risk to that. But is it worth spending the money? And that's where we do the cost-benefit analysis. So there are risk criteria in these countries, and these three countries have got one important thing in common, which is they're packed. These are three of the most densely populated countries. So if you've got a big empty country, in theory, you can put all the dangerous stuff where nobody lives. Like Kazakhstan's the size of Western Europe. Nobody should live next to anything dangerous. In fact, there's an area the size of Wales that used to be a nuclear testing ground that nobody's allowed in anymore. They just fenced off the whole area, and that's it. But in the UK, Netherlands, and especially in Hong Kong, you can't move anything there's not enough space. So these countries developed criteria that allowed them to make that judgment. And the other way is you compare things with the code, which is what British Gas did. They said, okay, we built everything to the code. What does that risk give us? Where do we go? Okay. There is this as low as reasonably practicable definition that comes from a court case from 1949, where a guy called Edwards was trying to sue the National Coal Board. He wanted them to put more safety equipment in his